Here we have all the different cavities that make up the human body. I like to say that humans are nothing but tubes because, I mean, really we are. We're just like one big long tube. But here we have the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. We can combine these two as the abdominopelvic cavity together. This is topped off by the diaphragm. And the thoracic cavity is where we have our lungs situated. This whole thing together is called the ventral cavity. Ventral means belly side. We have the spinal cavity here, which houses our vertebral column. And we have the cranial cavity that houses our brain. And all of this on the backside is known as the dorsal cavity. Dorsal means back. You probably have heard this term before in terms of dolphins that have a dorsal fin. It's a dorsal fin because it's on the back side. So dorsal means back. Moving now into different primary tissue types within animals. There's a lot to go through here and we'll walk through it pretty slowly. First, we'll talk about epithelial tissue. This is what lines our digestive tract and other hollow organs, and it also makes up our skin surface or epidermis. Then we'll move into connective tissue. This is a pretty diverse set of different types of tissue. It includes our tendons, our bones, and our fat or adipose. We have muscle tissue, including the cardiac, smooth, and skeletal muscle tissues. And then we have a nervous tissue, encompassing our brain tissue, spinal cord, and nerves. So first, delving into epithelial tissue. This covers the outside of organs and structures in the body, and it also lines the lumens of organisms in a single layer or even multiple layers of cells. The types of epithelia are classified by the shapes of the cells that encompass the tissues and the number of layers that are present within the tissue as you look at it under the microscope. Epithelia are composed of a single layer of cells when we call them simple epithelia. Epithelial tissue composed of multiple layers is what we know as stratified epithelia. So simple epithelia, we have single sheets. When we have multiple layers, we call that stratified epithelia. And this is a table that's found in your textbook that describes the cell shape found in the different epithelial tissues: squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. The description of what those cells look like, either flat, cube-shaped, tall and narrow, or round, or simple but appear stratified. And then the location where you can find that type of epithelial tissue. So first up is the squamous epithelia, or squamous epithelia, however you want to say it. These cells are generally round and flat with a centrally located nucleus. The cell outline is slightly irregular, and cells fit together to form a covering or a lining. Again, when they're arranged in a single layer, this is known as simple epithelia. And simple epithelia facilitates diffusion in tissues, as well as gas exchange in the lungs, nutrients exchange, and waste exchange in blood capillaries. So this is what it looks like under the microscope. You see that we have these irregular cell walls all jammed together, kind of like cobblestones on the front of a house. Next up is cuboidal epithelia. Just as their name suggests, they have a cube-shaped central nucleus. They're commonly found in a single layer representing simple epithelia in glandular tissue throughout the body, and they help secrete glandular material. They are found in the ducts of the kidney and the liver, where they are involved in filtering blood and keeping us healthy. Next, we have columnar epithelia. These columnar cells, they are very tall, narrow, and skinny. They're taller than they are wide, hence the name columnar. They resemble a stack of columns in an epithelial layer, most commonly found in single layer arrangement. So again, they are simple epithelia. The nuclei in the columnar epithelial cells in the lumen of the digestive tract, which is what this is a schematic of, the nuclei here tend to be found along the base, and these cells absorb material from the lumen of the digestive tract and prepare it for entry through the circulatory and lymphatic system. You'll also notice this thing labeled here called goblet cells. And these goblet cells at the top secrete mucus into the digestive tract lumen. Next up, what we call pseudostratified columnar epithelia. This is in the respiratory tract. Specifically, the schematic here is taking a look at pseudostratified columnar epithelia in the respiratory tract. So this tissue, compared to the previous slide, it appears to be stratified, but it's actually not really. So hence the name pseudostratified. It looks stratified, but it's not. Each cell is attached to the base of the membrane of the tissue, and therefore it is still simple in nature. The nuclei are arranged at different levels in the layer of cells, and that's why it looks like it's more than one layer. So you've got a nucleus up here and a nucleus down here, but the thing to pay attention to is that they are all attached at the base here. The cellular covering has cilia at the apica, or the free surface. So that's what these little protrusions are representing here. Those are cilia. And you should remember cilia is one of the features of eukaryotic cells. Cilia help facilitate movement. And specifically here in the respiratory tract, these cilia facilitate movement of mucus and harmful material out of the respiratory tract. This aids in protecting against harmful microbes or pollutants that you might breathe in. Again, we also have the presence of goblet cells. These are interspersed in some of the tissues and contain mucus that help to trap some of those irritants or pollutants or microorganisms. And goblet cells in tissues in the trachea are really, really good at keeping irritants and pollutants out of our lungs. So it's kind of like the guards standing ready and trapping things with mucus that might otherwise be harmful to our lungs were it to reach them. Next up is transitional epithelia. These are also called uroepithelial cells because they appear only in the urinary system. And when we say urinary system, we mean primarily the bladder and the ureter. And these cells here are arranged in a stratified layer, but they have the capacity to appear like they're being piled up on top of one another in a relaxed and empty bladder. And so here we're going to talk about why it's called transitional. So as the urinary bladder fills, the epithelial layer unfolds and expands to hold the increasing volume of urine in the bladder, kind of like a balloon. And so as the bladder fills, it expands, and that lining becomes thinner and thinner. So this is where the name transitional comes in. Depending upon the fullness of the bladder, the tissue transitions from thick when it's empty and all scrunched up on itself, and to thin when the bladder is full. So that's why we call it transitional. So all of that was epithelial. Next, we're getting into connective tissues. Connective tissues are made up of a matrix consisting of living cells and a non-living substance called the ground substance. Now, this ground substance itself is composed of something organic, like a protein, but also something inorganic, like a mineral or water. And the principal cell of connective tissue is called the fibroblast. And this cell makes the fibers found in nearly all of the connective tissues. Fibroblasts are motile. They're able to carry out mitosis, and they can synthesize whichever connective tissue is needed, which makes it a very versatile type of cell. Some tissues have specialized cells that are not found in others, as is depicted in this table. So here we have the different types of connective tissues. We have loose or areolar, we have dense fibrous connective tissues, cartilage, bone, adipose, and blood, which I didn't remember was a connective tissue until I made this lecture. So first here, loose or areolar tissue. This loose connective tissue has a sampling of all of the components of connective tissue. And we can take a look at what it's composed of here in this figure. We have fibroblasts. We also have collagen fiber and elastin fiber. So many things that are making up this loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue is found around every blood vessel and helps to keep the vessel in place. It's also found around and between most body organs. So in summary about the loose areolar tissue, it's tough but flexible and it comprises membranes. So very important is our loose areolar connective tissue. Moving into cartilage, this is also a connective tissue, but it has a large amount of matrix and variable amounts of fibers. The cells within cartilage are called chondrocytes, and these are found in spaces within the tissues called lacunae. And lacuna means hole or window. A cartilage with few collagen and elastic fibers is haline cartilage, which is depicted right here. The lacunae are randomly scattered throughout the tissue and the matrix. The sharks, actually, they get their name from this root word here. The sharks are known as cartilaginous fishes. And the scientific name for the order comprising the sharks is Chondriichthyes. So this is directly applicable to the coming lectures in Module 4 about specific groups of animals. Next up is bone. We can also call bone osseous tissue. The bone is connective tissue that has a large amount of two different types of matrix material. The organic matrix is similar to the matrix material found in other connective tissues, including some of collagen and elastic fibers. This gives strength and flexibility, which is very important for a bone. The inorganic matrix consists of mineral salts, mostly calcium salts, that give the tissue hardness. So without adequate organic material in the matrix, the tissue is going to break. But without adequate inorganic material, the tissue is going to bend too much. So it's a mix of both strength and flexibility. So we have three different types of cells that make up our bones. We have osteoblasts, which are responsible for modeling and growth. We have osteocytes, which are derived from the osteoblasts themselves. And finally, we have osteoclasts. These osteoclasts provide access to the calcium that's stored in tissues and helps break down bone for future remodeling. We have two different types of bone. We have compact and we have spongy. The subunits of compact bone are called osteons, which is right here. So compact bone makes up the hard part surrounding it. And if we were to zoom in on that, we would see compact bone made up of osteons, and then the spongy bone here, which is made up of tiny plates called trabeculae. And the trabeculae act as struts, basically, to confer stability and strength to the spongy bone. Moving on to adipose tissue or fat tissue. This is considered a connective tissue, even though it doesn't have fibroblasts or real matrix, and it actually only has a few fibers. It's made up of cells called adipocytes that collect and store fat in the form of triglycerides for energy metabolism. Adipose is really key in maintaining insulation for you and me, and adipose is going to be the main connective tissue that arises when we eat too much sugar in our diet. We can see under a microscope that adipose tissue cells appear empty due to the extraction of fat during the process of material for viewing. But here we have the nuclei in the adipose cells that are actually located at the cell edge. Next up, we have blood. We have two different types of living cells. We have the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, and we also have the white blood cells, the leukocytes. Contained within the leukocytes, we have different types, specifically the lymphocytes, the granulocytes, the monocytes, and the macrophages. So here's all that put together in addition to the fluid portion of the blood, which we call plasma here. So the cell that's found in the greatest abundance in blood is the red blood cell. And the leukocytes, the white blood cells, function primarily in immune response to foreign antigens or materials. And the different types of lymphocytes or white blood cells make antibodies that are tailored to foreign antigens and control the production of antibodies to fight the antigens. The neutrophils are phagocytic cells that participate in one of the early lines of defense against microbial invaders. They are able to engulf those invaders, and so it's important to have a high white blood cell count to prevent against infection. Next, we have muscle tissues. We have the three different types. We have smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. The smooth muscle type is the one that is the only one without striations. Skeletal and cardiac do have striations. What's interesting is that depending on what type of muscle type you are, you might have one nucleus or you might have many nuclei. They fall under different types of control. So you can voluntarily control your skeletal muscles, but the smooth and cardiac muscles are mainly under involuntary control, where you do not have control over them. The location for these are different. Cardiac, as the name suggests, is where you have your heart muscle. Skeletal is where you have skeletal muscles. And then your visceral organs are mainly composed of that smooth type of muscle. And here's what all of that looks like under the microscope. As we said previously, we don't see striations within the smooth muscle cells as we do in the skeletal and the cardiac. And we have different specialized function for each of these cells. And finally, we have nervous tissues. These are made up of specialized cells to receive and transmit electrical impulses from specific areas of the body. The main cell of the nervous tissue is called a neuron, and that's what we have here. And there are different subcomponents of the neuron. The large structure with a central nucleus is the center here. We have projections from the cell body. They are either dendrites, which are specialized in receiving signals, or we have axons on the other side, which are responsible mainly for transmitting signals. Astrocytes regulate the chemical environment around the nerve cell, and the oligodendrocytes insulate the axon, so the electrical nerve impulse is transferred more efficiently as it moves through the axon here.